Дорогі колеги, доброго вечора.
Dear colleagues, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us today for this event. This event is going to be about the book. This discussion is going to be about the book, not only about the book, because the issues, the metaphors raised by Ioulia in this book go way outside this book, and the book is only one outcome of this work. But I'm absolutely positive that this talk can involve other experience, other voices, and we are waiting for your involvement. The reason that we are here, the three of us, does not mean that you are not involved. I don't want you to imagine this table as the boundary between us, but just imagine that we are all sitting at the same table, so you are very welcome to get involved. Our event will be in two languages. In most cases, we'll be speaking Ukrainian, but at times one of us will be speaking English. If you need a pair of headsets, Sophia and Session is there to help you. Whoever needs headsets. Thank you. A few admin announcements. We hope that there won't be a read warning during our discussion. Nevertheless, we live in the war times that has been going on for 12 years. Today we will discuss the chronology, what is the beginning of the war, how the war intensifies, how it changes, how we experience war differently in different parts of our country. So in case of the air raid warning, we will take a decision together what to do next, depending on the level of threat posed by this air raid warning. Hopefully there won't be any. Another thing is that this event is held as part of Source as the Choice series of events. So it's about what is the source, how we choose the sources, and what are the multiple solutions related to this choice. This event is organized by the Center of Urban History, the program document of Ukraine, and also the newly established institution, the Research Center of Ukraine, the Foundation of Max Repeter. So this is our event, this is our program. If you're interested, you can watch other events of ours in our YouTube channel, including Ioulia's presentation. Today we'll be talking about the caring citizens, war, women, and the making of the common in Ukraine. It's a great luxury for me to talk to you in Ukrainian, because we can talk about the gender of words, we can talk about caring citizens, we can also talk about gender in French. This is the language of this book, and if you listen to this discussion in English, unfortunately English does not have caregiving gender sensitive word. That's why in our today's talk, in Ukrainian or in English, if we switch between languages, we'll be talking about women. We'll be talking about war and about caregiving. Three notions can be unpacked in a very complex way, to say nothing about the commonness, which is very important phenomena for a series of disciplines, sociology, anthropology, etc. My name is Natalia Otrishchenko. I'm a researcher and coordinator of oral history projects at the Center for Urban History, and I am in charge of one of the projects related to internally displaced people. And today we also have Ioulia Shukan with us, a sociologist, professor at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris, and also researcher at the Center for Caucasian, East European and Central Asian Studies. She's the author of the book about the caring citizens, war, women, and the making of the common Ukraine, that was published this year in French. And I believe that this book will also be open for other audiences, especially when it sounds in Ukrainian, English, and other languages. Also, we are pleased to have Evgenia Nesterovich today with us, culture manager, critic, writer, who is the leader of the team of the NGO Postbellum Ukraine, and we will be talking about a variety of things today. And now I'd like to give the floor over to Ioulia, who will share her story. Ioulia, you are working in Paris and all your career is related with the French Academy. How come you ended up in Kharkiv, in military hospital, together with women who were giving care to the wounded women? Thank you, Natalia. Thank you for organizing this event, this discussion. Thank you. And thank the Center for Urban History, because coming back is like coming home, and I'm grateful to Evgenia who agreed to read 2 parts that I translated into English, and we will try to discuss this book. It all started in 2014 or even earlier, during Maidan. Prior to that, I worked in political sociology, and I have always been interested in elites. I once wrote a PhD study about communist elites of the late Soviet period and independent Ukraine and Belarus. Later on, I worked with elites with the ethnographic focus, and my prior project was about the parliamentary practice, the members of parliament, how they either collect support or they buy support because they exchange the voice for some material benefits. But since the beginning of Maidan, because that was not only a very important event for the country, but also that was the understanding how different events can affect our academic trajectory. So I stand in the focus of ethnographic studies, but I was also interested as a citizen during Maidan about the participation of different people in revolutionary situations, their experience, their emotions, their intense experience, how it affects the trajectory of people. And when the war started in 2014, I was also thinking how to talk about society, being a psychologist, and how to talk about the impact of war on society, where the place of sociologists is during the war, how to relate about the war. Should we be somewhere closer to the front line to understand better the war, or maybe to find a different place? And I've been looking for this place for a long time. In 2014, I was traveling across Ukraine. I was in Dnipro, Zaporizhia, in Kyiv. I started with Kyiv military hospital. Prior to ending up in Kharkiv military hospital, I was involved in different voluntary initiatives because volunteering was a phenomenon that mirrored the changes in society. And in February 2015, together with Sofia Lamborghini, who is my friend, we ended up in Kharkiv, and that was our first acquaintance with Kharkiv military hospital, and something happened. So this is also the magic when you realize that this is where you belong. I had never worked in sociology and caregiving field. I rather worked in political sociology. So being a clean sheet of paper, I entered this sociology, I joined the group, and by relating to about my role as sociologist, I remember that back then I was writing my first book about the events of Maidan and volunteering as a phenomenon. And for general public, it was not an academic work. And I was writing one chapter, and I was interested in working in that hospital. I worked as a volunteer. There were a lot of different women and men who joined in this initiative. Many left, but I stayed, and those who were with me when we volunteered prior to full-scale invasion. Thank you very much for this story of positioning and your multiple relations with this topic and those people and this research. I'll give you a little bit of space to talk more about this journey that lasted longer than 9 years, about the relationship that you built with those 6 volunteers, and also about the book. Could you announce what we can expect? We agreed that I would switch into English for the presentation, and later I will switch into Ukrainian again. So I'm switching
It's a
into
book about
English.
hospital volunteering, and I'm a book written, of course, for foreign audience. So I'm explaining in the beginning of the book also what volunteering means and what hospital volunteering means, which maybe is not needed here before this audience. So hospital volunteering during the war, first intensive and then protracted war in the east of Ukraine. And it's a book about one case, actually. It's a case study, Благодійний фонд, an initiative called Sister of Mercy, Сестра Милосердя, ATO Kharkiv, for anti-terrorist operation. That's how this war have been called in the very beginning. And it's a story of 7 women, so it's a micro case. 7 women who was there since 2014 and who stayed till the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Later on I can go over the trajectories after the full-scale invasion, but actually the book and all my research are focused on this period. So I entered the field in 2015 and I stayed till 2022. So this volunteering is about shortcomings of the military health system, of course, chronicle underfunding, old used equipment, shortages of medical supplies and drugs, and those shortcomings define, of course, different types of activities, assistance, non-medical assistance. They are not medical personnel, but also it's a kind of assistance in direct contact with suffering, sick and wounded bodies of combatants of the military in this war. Monitoring hospital patients and their needs, providing different logistical assistance, helping to get up, to move, to providing food assistance also. So a way of helping with these temporary inconveniences or severe disabilities, actually, of bodies, moral physical support, but non-professional once again, and accompanying patients to different stages of this health care, prosthetics, readaptation, physical readaptation, and psychological also. So mainly it's a volunteering about, this volunteering is about repairing in a very practical and direct manner of those shortcomings of military medicine. And that's what I am calling making of the common. I'm using this, borrowing and relying on pragmatic sociology, French sociology. What it means making of the common, it's participating on different levels into these collective efforts, so to repair the state of deprivation of military medicine and providing and producing in this way the common good of very attentive, family-like, comprehensive, free of charge care, actually, which is considered by these women as being the only one and the only appropriated for the combatants. So in this book, I try to shed light on circumstances and driving forces that are behind this commitment. Why women who are not professionals of care at one point felt moved by the events and came to the hospital. I also grasp these biographical reconfigurations, actually, that take place through volunteering. Some of them are still volunteering, actually, so it's more than 10 years of involvement. Others are not, but have been there at least till 2020-22. So what the war actually in this volunteering produced did to them as women, as working women, married, divorced, as mothers, and also as ordinary citizens who has been always very far from politics and from any forms of involvement in the common, actually, and how the practices of citizenship have been reconfigured. So behind there is this sociological puzzle, where usually in sociology I'm trying to undo those puzzles, of the strength of this civic commitment. Because, yeah, with the time this question of why they are staying actually. The war is far, the society is not concerned, at least many people have not been concerned, this war have been invisible for many, so why these women are still there actually, why they do not disengage. State capacities have been also rebuilt in some way, military medicine have been doing better than in 2020, why they are still there. And why they are still there, because also this question seemed to me relevant, because I have seen many challenges, difficulties, moments of doubts actually, that those women experienced in this context of protracted war. And of course, this question of solidity of this involvement is interesting in sociological terms, because in the Western context, specific Western context, we are talking about very flexible involvements. They are much more flexible, they are much more short-lived. So my question was, if there is something related to the war or to the care that explains this long-term commitment. You are following on the time. We have a clock there. Okay. I don't know at what time I started, just not to exceed my 20-minute limits. So just briefly, it's an ethnography. So I became volunteer myself, and it's through these experiences of volunteering that I produced my analysis, which meant actually gaining acceptance, of course. Entering the field means also to negotiate a place, building trust, knowing how to live and when to live. And I had been also confronted with this question, when I have to leave actually. And strangely enough, the full-scale invasion was this moment actually, which closed the field for me. Also, of course, this question of notes, taking notes. So I have been always taking notes on trying to exercise my memory. So remember during the day different sequences. I have never been conducting interviews. I have only been discussing with them and acting in different situations. And also, as I've mentioned, it's a very inductive dimension. Enter this field as a blank, as blank as possible. Actually, even in sociology, it's difficult to be blank, of course. So this becoming myself a volunteer helped me to get this very intimate and embodied experience, actually, but also to share different moments. So I have been doing volunteering with them at the hospital. I have been with them at different moments of leisure activities, for example. They have been organizing for military patients. I have been with them to funerals or to some memorial visits to the cemetery number 18 in Kharkiv, where the combatants of this war have been buried, alley of glory, and they have been maintaining, keeping order also in this cemetery. So different moments when, which was also an occasion to discuss. We discussed a lot. And I asked them questions, and we discussed about their senses, their feelings, their experiences, perceptions of themselves, and of what was going on both in the hospital but also at the level of the country. And I hope that there are some critics, actually, of course, related to ethnography, and I hope that I managed to bypass them, because I try to contextualize as much as possible. It's a case study, but it's inscribed in the context. I try to generalize from this case study, so also a methodological challenge, and I tried also to find this question of subjectivity, yeah, how not to be, as you are close and very involved with people, how can you analyze and get in a kind of distance also, because I have been also very, this kind of involvement has been very admirable. By myself at the beginning, so how you see pitfalls, difficulties, yeah, and how you talk about them in a book. I will just very briefly, the 6 chapters, just to give you the different dimensions of what I have been analyzing, and I will go to conclusions. So in the first chapter, first 2 chapters are contextual. Precisely, I was trying not to be ahistorical. Even if this history starts in 2014 only, it was a choice also, actually. So I offered an overview of volunteering groups that have emerged in the early 2014, in this context of the country sliding slowly into the war. And I also try to relate actually this general overview with this initiative. So Sister of Mercy trying to position themselves. And the group actually in this broader mobilization. So I go back to their social trajectories, socio-biographical profiles. I show that they correspond actually to this general picture of volunteering. They're around at the middle age 35. They're women. They care about wounded soldiers, so the gendered dimension in this volunteering. They live in big cities. They have higher education. Maybe the only difference I defend in this chapter is they're not middle class actually, and there is this argument that volunteering is related to the middle class, and it's not the case. Chapter 4, I have this kind of bottom-up view on the military hospital. As I have negotiated my entry in the field, I was not supposed to talk to medical personnel, so I have never talked to medical personnel. So it's a military unit, this hospital. I have, through what I have seen in and through different interactions, I try to reconstruct this context of a military hospital in 2014, which determines, of course, the scope and type of activities, actually, of volunteering. Chapters 3 and 4 precisely is about this why question, why they engage, how they engage, and what are the transformative effects on the volunteers. So I follow step-by-step, this step-by-step involvement in volunteering, paying attention to two actually dimensions, both socio-biographical characteristics, women, age, family configuration, children, profession, of course, all those factors that can impact this kind of involvement. But I was also thinking and reflecting about all those lived experiences of the beginning of war, what it meant to be in Kharkiv actually in the spring 2014, to see fights in the streets, to be moved or not moved by what was going on in the city, which was at the edge actually, and was also sliding slowly into very confrontational confrontation. And in this chapter 4, I show this impact of volunteering. So 10 years of volunteering means that your life also changes, and I show that this volunteering have interconnected different dimensions of life. Profession is volunteering. Sociabilities, so friends, are also related to volunteering. Family life, for many of them, it's also related to volunteering. Different activism is also about volunteering. So everything became volunteering. And I related it to this routinization of war. So this caring for wounded became a kind of routine for them, something very ordinary and very, very inscribed in their life. So when you take one brick, for example, from this wall, everything falls. And I shown the example of 3 of them, how they tried to disengage and how it was difficult precisely because it was about breaking this harmony between different dimensions of their life. And chapter 5 and 6 are more about relationship to the institution of military medicine and the hospital itself, and to the political, which I mean by political, I mean not institutional politics, but this making of the common, precisely. And so I show, I reflect on this interplay between formal and informal assistance, and the way it has been provided. And in the chapter 6, I reflect about citizenship. And I understand citizenship not in the sense of rights and duties. So it's not a classic approach to citizenship. Citizenship for me is a relation, it's a process, and it's a multitude of practices actually. And everyone exercises citizenship according to oneself of one's sense of capacity. If I feel myself capable of doing something in this context of war, so I find a new activity for me and I exercise it. And in this sense, those women have engaged precisely and have negotiated a new role for themselves, being caring citizens. So I go back very quickly to conclusions. So what I'm showing is both, it's a case study, as I told, so it's a kind of very particular case of volunteering, But I defend that it's characteristic of broader patterns of female commitment in caregiving during wartime, but also a broader pattern of making of the common. Because this role of caregiving women citizens, we will find it in different, other different spheres. We can find it. We can find those mechanisms of step-by-step involvement in volunteering, as it's the case for these women. Biographical effects can be the same, actually, because a long-term involvement necessarily changes life of people involved. Practices, and this question of informality of volunteering is characteristic also of the way volunteering is exercised in Ukraine. And this question of relationship to the state, also not waiting for the state, but also interacting with the state while expecting for more state and being defiant of the state. So this tension is present in other relationships between citizens and the state. And I also show that both this kind of volunteering, hospital volunteering, it's of course, it reproduces gender hierarchies. So, because women caring about men, I show also different moments how those women contribute to naturalize actually this role of caregiving citizen, and also they're exposed to gendered critics because they have, according to others, and those critics have forgot their premier role of mother, and they devoted themselves to soldiers and to caregiving, to people who are behind the family, precisely. But at the same time, I see this dynamic of emancipation, citizens' emancipation, in the sense that they have found a new role for themselves. They have never been involved in this production of the common before, and they have elaborated themselves through their involvement this new role. And the citizenship is in the making, because if I have time later on and I go back to their trajectories, it's still changing actually over time. I also show this, we will talk about materiality, informality, but also how materiality can contribute to rebuild an institution, precisely, and to rebuild the medicine. And maybe the last point, the very last one, how this volunteering is socially valorized, bringing social recognition, provides patterns and scripts actually for action for everyone in 2022, but also it's liable to critics, both for non-contribution to formal reforms and reforming process, but also it comes with a high social cost for volunteers themselves, because it has been associated with a loss of job, partial unemployment, material and financial difficulties, physical and emotional exhaustion, while also producing this very paradoxical nature of this volunteering, that those women became professional caregivers and could have actually act as a professional volunteer. So I'll stop here. Maybe it was too long. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Ioulia. And we were privileged to read an introduction, conclusion, and also one of the chapters of the book which Ioulia provided to us. And thank you for this extra work, this translation. So I hope it's just one of the first steps into this book, talking to different audiences.
I have a lot of questions and comments after reading this book. I hope that we can unfold them. But a few topics that you have covered in your discussion, and I would like Evgenia to step in and reflect on that. So your book about the caring citizens, and our project is the Treasures of Memory. So it's also about women from Donetsk region who are relating about their experience of 2014-2021 primarily. So we are gathering chronology again. And it's very demonstrative, Ioulia, that your book starts with the response of your characters to full-scale invasion, and that was one of the symbols that this book is for the French audience. And in order to localize this war that was very distant, very remote, and very strange for Europeans, but at the same time it was also invisible and not understandable. So we saw from the Kharkiv perspective. Now we will look at the Donetsk perspective. Thank you very much for inviting me and for allowing me to read the abstracts from this book. It would be very interesting to see it in Ukrainian, Ukrainian translation, because it's very important. Our project, it's not a research as such. There are fewer generalization and there are more cases of biography. My organization collects oral history for big international public archive, the memory of peoples. And in 2024, the entire year, we worked in Kramatorsk, and the topic was Kramatorsk through the prism of Kramatorsk women, and the project was called The Treasures of Memory, because we were collecting oral history of women of the older generation. In our case, so these women were between 40 to 82 years old. These were 27 oral interviews. They were all processed using our methodology and published on the website of our archive. But one, because one of our characters did not want it to be published, 26 were recorded in Kramatorsk and 7 were recorded in Lviv with those citizens of Kramatorsk who were IDPs. And based on this project, we created a series of public products with the idea of relating the history of Kramatorsk, the history of Ukraine, Donetsk region, through the prism of their story and their views. Since we are working with international audience as well, so we decided to record a few target interviews, and the international exhibition that is still traveling throughout Europe and is being translated. It was called Kramatorsk, the city at the front line. So this exhibition is about the city of Kramatorsk, the Ukrainian war through Kramatorsk, through the history of its residents. There are 9 stories from the collection that refer to specific important stages of the history of this city, different locations in this city, and they talk about Russian aggression, because Kramatorsk in the Czech news was mentioned only through this perspective. There was also a movie that was made for Ukrainian audience. The movie was included those experiences and those stories. It was made by Oля Povoroznik in Evacuation, and this film is called Since 2014, Female Stories of Donetsk Region. At the same time, we collected stories together with Girls Media. So this is magazine which portrayed the stories of 5 of our characters, female characters, who were very active women, who are actively involved in civil life. The idea of the project emerged in 2023 when I was in Kramatorsk. Occasionally I saw a book about Ukrainian women in Second World War. I was a guest in the private residence in Kramatorsk. I saw a book with the feminist optics, and I saw that there was inscription from the public association which was called Pani, Mrs. I started asking about this organization, and I found out that since 2014 in Kramatorsk, because of the great number of IDPs from Donetsk region, there was a great number of activists who are very pro-Ukrainian, because they were afraid to stay in Donetsk, and they were the first to get evacuated from Donetsk region, which became People's Republic of Donetsk. And part of those entrepreneurs, activists, were actively involved in the civic life of Kramatorsk. They intensified it in the city, and they converted it throughout 8 years prior to 2022, the city into the public center of Donetsk region. There were a series of non non-governmental organizations actively involved in municipal life at the level of decision-making, cooperation with the government, and community life. And what seemed to me back then is that it would be interesting to tell this story from the viewpoint of peripheral town and from the viewpoint of Czech viewers, because 180,000 citizens of Kramatorsk, it does not make it a small town. From Ukrainian perspective, it's a town. I wanted to relate about the history of Ukraine, about those people who were living at the front line, because Kramatorsk was occupied and deoccupied in 2014, and the testimony of our female characters start with their childhood, and in 2014 there is also the bifurcation point, and the last 10 years between 2014 until 2024, so the events are so intense that the movie could not focus on anything else but this. We also realized that the prospects and the angle of view of 2022 allowed people in Drohobych, Uzhhorod, in other Ukrainian cities to hear the story about 2014, which was not heard before either at all, or there were only minor parts that were heard. And this movie was shown with the help of two facilitators. One was Alexandra Papina and the other was Lesa Vorozdetska, who was sociologist. So they facilitated this discussion, and the discussion of this movie proved times again that the space for discussion about events of 2014 became the platform for discussion when the war started for you. And indeed, those who experienced the war in 2022 had a chance to voice it to those for whom the war started in 2014. Another important thing is that we did not invite only women to this demonstration of the movie, but primarily in our audience there were women. I'm going to talk about that later. What Ioulia mentioned was that she was afraid that she would lack distance to write about that, because she was an involved observer. When we finished our project at the end of last year, beginning of this year, I was trying to write some conclusive text. I had an agreement about the publication of this conclusive essay. I believe that I have produced several versions of these conclusions that had never been published, because from my viewpoint, what was lacking was involvement. I believe that I have no right to write about this history from the position of the narrator that I found myself in, regardless the fact that I lived with them for the entire year, regardless the fact that I related the story and read the story many times. Nevertheless, I did not feel I have the right to deal with it as an author. And this perspective as a researcher that is present in Ioulia's work gives the optics and the right to generalize and look at those stories as case study and not separate biographies and separate stories. Therefore, I'm grateful for the opportunity to read this book. Thank you. I believe that we have already singled out a few topics in our presentation. We are talking about different audiences, how we adapt our own voice depending on who we talk to, who hears us, whether this is the outside audience, whether it's a very specific audience, because I presume that Czech and French readers can be different given the background knowledge that they have. This is also about the distance, and thank you for this note as to who has the right to talk from whose position, because Ioulia started talking about her positioning, about the involvement in the field, and thank you for casting the light on this tension that we have when you talk about the experience of others and how far or close you are to the experience to have the right to talk about that, and which role you use, whether you're a researcher or you're talking from the viewpoint of media who are expecting the entire format of talk from us. If you allow me, I'll ask you a few more questions and then we will open up our discussion, but you can prepare your comments or questions now. When we are talking about caregiving, we are talking about this first unit, this first item. So we as people who experience caregiving. Ioulia, the organization who you work with, the Sisters of Mercy, so you basically use the category of family closeness. Before the event, we talked about that. And this model of family caregiving also is transformed into different social groups. A few years ago, we had a series of events with the involvement of Yevhen Holovacha, the sociologist. So that was about the role of Tadeusz Rolke, Tomorrow is Going to Be Better, where we were talking about the transformational period of the 90s. And Yevhen Holovacha said that the period of transformation in Ukraine was the best lived through by the Social Institute of Family, that modeled the different interactions in different social institutes in our country. And if we think about the practice of caregiving and the commonness, so is this common familial, where your volunteers in hospital took care of the wounded soldiers as mothers or sisters, because you use those notions, and who are those common whose memory those treasurers are trying to cherish? Because we are thinking about memory as unifying construct that based on Halifax is only possible in social groups, and we remember that different groups tell us what is worth remembering. How the people who cherish the memory construct this element of social. Do they also talk about the element of caregiving as the imaginary common and as an important thing for themselves? Thank you, Natalia, for the question and reflection. I'd like to get back to the chronology issue. You're absolutely right that this introduction, my introduction, is for the foreign French audience. At the same time, it's for Ukrainian audience, because it's very routine discussion, what happened, how the war started for you, etc. But it's not only the thoughts about the audience. That was also the requirement of the publishing house, to understand how this presence, how this intensity of the full-scale invasion, how it crushed the memory. And understanding of what was in 2014. I thought that that was the phenomenon typical of Ukrainians only, because indeed that was the moment of intensification of the war in geographical scope and military scope and the involvement of the society, the impact on society. But I did not even think that that affects that much on the perception of Ukraine in the West. Because this war in the East was being discussed for a long time, but it was discussed and mentioned from the viewpoint of geopolitics, of the recent years, negotiations, peace, expectations, etc. And little was talked about social actors, dynamics, the processes, but this presence was also present in the publishing house, and it was difficult to offer a book in this context when the journalists had already reflected and provided their feedback. Therefore, according to me, that was important to go back to 2014. When you read the first chapter, you understand how much it reflects with the event of 2014, the forms of mobilization, etc. But it also changed my focus, because we were talking about the continuity and discrepancies. And in the introduction itself, you understand that I'm in the paradigm of continuity, and this is the the effect of my previous research, because volunteers perceive 24th of February 2022 as continuity. Of course, we were not ready to such scope of full-scale invasion, but all of them were talking about continuity. We had been doing that, we had already been mobilized, we know what to do, we are ready. But if we look at their trajectories, so it's also about the breach, it's not only about the continuity. As for the families, indeed, I talk a lot in this chapter about formal and informal caregiving. I'm not trying to separate them, I'm trying to show how they interact in different volunteering practice. So volunteers are also building relations depending on the age, whether this is the sister and brother or mother and brother, depending on the age of the serviceman. I'm talking about authoritarian relationship, that this is not only the caregiving and not only positive emotions, but there are different dynamics, authoritarian dynamics. So this is the assistance to become autonomous, independent. This is help to the serviceman to get back to the independent state. But this is also about dependencies and how this care produces different types of dependencies. And I believe that those familial relations become a model, or rather a continuation of those role models that these women play in private life and in their family life and the life of volunteers. And this is also the project for the states, through the practice, through materiality of the practice that I analyze. I see that this is their expectation from the state. And I said that there is always a lack of trust to the government. The government is being criticized in different situations. The attitude towards the state is criticized. And the practice of volunteering generates the model of what caregiving should be like. And the family here and the family roles are indeed a model, and this is the project for the state. By getting ready to our meeting, I looked through the profile and I understand that it would be difficult to single out amongst those heroines those who have this caregiving job and those who don't have, because some have experience of volunteering which is rather long and they continue doing it in different activities in different cities. In most cases, they take care of IDP starting from 2014, then they take care of the servicemen, they are trying to offer them support and provisions, and later they take care of the elderly and the pets and animals in general. In those public products that I have mentioned, there is one character who manages the shelter of pets who were rescued from the occupied territories. There is another one who manages the shelter for the elderly people who were rescued and evacuated from the occupied territories. None of them had experience doing that before, so this is the experience gained through the circumstances. But majority of our female characters all this time, back in 2014 and up till today, so they have children and they have elderly parents. And when we were getting prepared to the conversations, when we were preparing the questionnaire, we were assisted by Olena Styashkina, and with the entire team we thought what we should ask about, what is the right way to ask, the right question formation, because this is the the sphere of caregiving. Women believe that this is the done thing, and it's not that important, that it's not the topic for discussion. Later, when we provided the recorded interviews to be deciphered by other authors, in first storytellings we had to get those stories back, and they asked us to rewrite those stories because it said she married, she gave birth to a child, because women write about other women, knowing that this is the project about the activists and they all have the feministic optics, but later you open the story, she married, she had a child, she had another child, the child went to school, the child finished school, etc., etc. And it was very unexpected observation for me, because in this project 98% of participants indeed were with the corresponding optics. But this care of the common and the time that they invest into this care, so they relate about it themselves, and that was very remotely. They put it on the margins of their histories, and it was very difficult to cover it. And my favorite story was from Kramatorsk. So we did a 2-hour interview and we took a break, and one of our female characters says, by the way, I was in the city council twice. I was a member of the city council, and we were flabbergasted. Why didn't you tell about that? Why would I brag about that? Later, when I discussed it with Oksana Deshchakivska, she told me about very interesting stats. Prior to the change of legislation, when you could become the member of city council not being the member of the party, so 59% were women in the city councils. Later, when we moved to the party representatives, so this percentage dropped to 35. Fewer women want to be involved in political life, even if the woman is very proactive. So she doesn't want to be involved in political institutional activities, and creating the common, making the common and getting involved in that from the viewpoint of our prospect says that it was not seen by our volunteers as the common, as something that has political essence, but something that is important for the community. And when you ask about that, so they are being humble and they are trying to distance themselves from that. But when you dig deeper, so they understand that the Council of Entrepreneurs and Municipal Council was led by a woman. The system of kindergartens in this city was also initiative of women's organization, etc., etc. So these are the things. Women are in charge of the social sphere, the elderly, the children, the healthcare. So these are the things that make the fabric, social fabric of the city. It seemed like an air. So as long as you have it, you don't notice it. And for me, it's very important to highlight such stories, such simple stories. I was very happy about this project in this girls' magazine, glossy magazine. We should show them what important things are done by this routine corny work. There is nothing to be proud of, there is nothing to brag about, but this is the contribution into the common well-being that ensures the quality of life. Thank you very much. These are very important comments, and I believe that we can talk about the transformation of gender orders in Ukraine, what type of work is done by what type of people, visible, not visible, needed, not needed, better paid, worse pay, etc. I have many more questions, but I want to give the floor to our audience because I believe there are at least 3 questions from the audience. So let's hear all 3 and then answer them. Ioulia Shukan, political scientist. Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion, for this important presentation. I have tons of questions, but I'm going to be humble and I'll ask one question, but it's very important one. It was very interesting to listen to this presentation. I want to see this book both in Ukrainian and English, and I wanted to ask all of you to comment. First of all, I want Ioulia to comment and other panelists to comment this observation that in Ukraine, the Institute of Family adapted and survived the best. I do the research of political economics of post-Soviet Ukraine, and the way the Institute of Family survived makes me wonder. I'm not even talking about the waves of migration. I'm not talking about how many women take care of other families across Europe. They work in Europe. I don't like saying they work in brothels, but I have to say that. And how many men work in farms and construction projects, and their parents were taken care of by grandchildren. And from my radical feministic viewpoint, there was kickback and regression of gender roles of women with extreme socialization, with the worsening of social position of women. So I want you to comment on that. How do you see it in your work, and what is your position, how this Institute of Family survived and what it did to gender roles? At the end, there was a very interesting comment. I'm about to finish because I know I talk a lot. The comment is that super active women who were involved in political life on communities. So they had to learn the legislation, they had to take serious decisions, they had to balance very serious roles. And it's not even mentioned or mentioned by the way. And it shows that women are trying to underestimate their role, and this underestimation of role of a woman is so much embedded and imprinted into the consciousness of a woman. So patriarchal family did not only survive, because those who read the literature, they don't see how important is what they do. There were 3 questions, right? So we will take 3 questions now, and then we will take more. Thank you very much for this presentation and for the argument and for sharing this important thoughts. I'd like to start my question with the phrase that I took note from Ioulia's presentation about building acceptance. Could you talk more about building trust with the respondents, those who you worked with? Because a lot of things reflect to me. Could you invite us into this page of your research? I'd like to hear more about that. And another question is about the history of Kramatorsk. How did people open their stories? How did people relate about that? If you can cover that, I would be grateful. Thank you. I saw Daria, Hanna, Artem, and someone else raised hand. So far, okay, I have 2 questions, but maybe I will ask only one. Ioulia said that 2022 crushed the memory of 2014. This phrase resonates. Can you reflect about that, especially about the history of Kramatorsk and after 2022? Are there any observations, or did the respondents comment on that, that their stories of 2014 and 2022 differed? We can only imagine how much it was different and how it was different. I will start with the last question. These were not the volunteers who said that. That was my understanding about the correlation between the beginning of the war in 2014 and 2022. I believe that during this field work, I always felt that the volunteers and the society and the war and the intensity of the combat activities was probably slightly forgotten. It was there was a certain distribution in the community of volunteers and the servicemen and the people who lived not far from the front line. So that was one world. The other world was the world of society that forgot about this war. And I believe that 2022 intensified the feelings that this war was not discussed, was forgotten, was not recognized as the war, was not named as war. And this feeling is probably subjective, but I argumented this experience as such that should be talked about, this experience of mobilization. Of course, we all focus on 2022 because this experience was different from 2014, but that was rather my perception than the perception of the volunteers. However, they lived in this misunderstanding and they always compared themselves to the military because the society does not understand their experience. And many situations that I describe in the book, it means that they are somewhere on the margin of society, not on the same level. How to enter the field and how to rebuild the relationship of trust. Entering the field was easy, especially at the beginning. When I entered this field, so there was quite a turnover of staff. Many people joined the volunteering activity, they tried and they left. And I believe I managed to build this trust with my continuous presence. Given the fact that I was in France, I wasn't in Kharkiv all the time, but it was very important for me to come back. So that was graphical returning in English. So every 2 or 3 months, depending on my schedule of teaching at university. But with my presence, with my involvement, with my interest to the initiative, I showed that I was part of it. I was the stable part of this community. However, there were some limitations given the distance and given the fact that I wasn't always in Kharkiv. And this definitely affected the result of my research. But nevertheless, my continuous presence and my continuous involvement in hospital volunteering played a role. Each of us defined the limit we wanted to work with, whether we wanted to be close to the body or further from the body, work in volunteering room or assist the medical personnel. However, those interventions were not medical in nature. I also found my role. I was one of those who either worked with bodies directly, or I worked as a volunteer in a different room. So The situation and the absence of clear requirements to the role of the volunteering contributed to my entering this field and being able to rebuild those relationships of trust. But it was very difficult to leave this field, and these dependencies on volunteering, it's something that I myself felt, and this trust that you build with the actors that I worked with, so it was important not to lose it. And even during the writing of the book, things I can say, things I cannot say, how far I can go, because I was present in different experiences and there were things I could write about and things I could not. As for the Institute of Family, first of all, volunteers were not shown in gender perspective, and the configuration of the family is very different. When you enter this field of activity, half of the women belong to broken families, because the woman was taking different roles: a caring mother, a breadwinner, those who had to find funds for the family. So that was the multiple roles that one woman played. But the family and the family life as a model that I had mentioned, because I mentioned the Institute of the Family as a model that they reproduce and naturalize their role as caring women who came to help and assist the military. And that's why this role of sister or mother, so that was continuation of the social roles that they played in their families. As for the family, indeed, I was impressed during my research, because I expected bigger presence of the family, but the family was not there, which probably is explained by economic factors, because Kharkiv is far from Mykolaiv and the family cannot always be there and constantly be there. So there is economic component here. Therefore, it was easy for those women to replace the family for those servicemen. For them, it was natural and it was continuation of their natural roles. But the family was almost not there. They were not present in the hospital. And since 2022, if we take the example of Kharkiv, that intensified and enhanced, because that was the transit hospital. Prior to 2022, it was not transit hospital, and military stayed there for a long time. I will start with the question about the family and about the gender role dimensions. What I learned working in that project, especially preparing those questionnaires and consulting with Ioulia Shukan and getting the team together, because we brainstormed together. We had people from media, we had historians, we had those who worked in public archive, what we can do with the stories, what we cannot do. And I learned then from the perspective of the 20th century, so women of that age group from 40 to 70 years old were those who take the burden of the crisis economic period. So this is after the war, these are the 90s, those years that we live in, because this is the category of women that have children who need care, and almost always they have elderly parents who require care as well. And the models of economic creativity, how to address the issue, they are absolutely extensive. What Ioulia Shukan helped us, it's to word the questions so that these women can talk about those things as their victory, life victory, and not the horrible times that they survived. And almost every woman had a story. How she managed to buy Kinder Surprise chocolate for her kid at least once a week. And when you are trying to convert the story into something in the public space, for example, Instagram story or an article in the journal or a magazine, oftentimes women are ashamed of that. In that project, we made an exclusion and we agreed on every publication with our characters. In oral history, according to our methodology, it's not an approved fact. We do not approve the publication with our hearers. But in this particular case, we decided to verify it in order to guarantee the comfort and highlighting the story by the heroes so that they can possess those stories. And underestimating their own contribution was seen in all stages and even now in storytellings. However hard we try, we don't see the social input of our characters. However, it is present, it is there. How do characters open up? In our case, we always try to find involved interviewers, and in that project we involved Kramatorsk journalists who we taught our methodology. Later on, they were also the characters of our project. So this is the publication Kramatorsk Post. They cooperated with us and I'm grateful to them because without their involvement it wouldn't be the same. We tried to write a few stories in Lviv. Nevertheless, we had a very experienced interviewee, but nevertheless, that was a woman from Lviv. She was asking the woman from Kramatorsk about her experience, and this woman keeps the distance and she doesn't want to talk about many things, and therefore our approach is always the following. We always try to find interviewers who know the context. Can we say that 2022 crashed the memory of 2014 from our prospect? Probably not, rather no. They felt that they have a chance to talk about 2014 out loud because 2022 gave the space for it to be voiced outside their own environment. Ms. Tashkina, who was at our presentation, she said that she wanted to share this experience until 2017. Later, she didn't want to. Until 2022, those stories would probably sound differently. We started recording in 2022, and therefore I don't have the data what it would sound before that. Before that, we recorded a project which was not related to the war. These were the stories of public activism in different industries, in different sectors of life, and I participated as the interviewer. And I remember that the elder generation were talking about the 70s, the 80s through the prism of the relevant events. And they lived through it intensely, but they remembered the story from their school life about the teacher who quoted Simonenko, and they refer to the relevant Russian aggression of 2022. Definitely these stories sound differently because they affect the way we relate. Whatever we are talking about, we always talk through the prism of the present time. That's why this is the expectation of the publisher. So we can talk about the past, but we can also involve the present, and we're also talking about time and space. So Artem, Hanna, and someone else raised hand. I'm also waiting for the book to be translated. Ioulia, I don't know whether the work on Belarus makes you an expert on post-Soviet space, but when we are talking about the involvement of the community, which is called volunteering, but the conflicts of different types of intensity, so Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, were they noticeable to you? Were they a good example for you? Because I know certain cases, I know the involvement of Armenian community in the conflict. So does that remind you of anything? Good evening. Thank you for organizing this event. Very interesting discussion. I have a question for you, Yulia, but maybe Evgenia will also contribute. I'm trying to grasp the theory of citizenship that you mentioned, that you see the citizenship in a broader sense, that it's not only the rights and responsibilities, but that's also the practice and relationship, and the theory of citizenship is also about the acts of citizens. It's something that is outside the boundaries of the common practice. It's something that changes and reconfigures the relationship between the citizens, the state, and the citizens. In this case, the volunteering activity of those women that started in 2014 was that the act of citizenship. And in the process of volunteering, were there any examples of the acts of citizenship or some atypical, abnormal practices? And I also would like to hear about the relationship. What were the relationship between those women and the state in the broad sense, especially given the hospital where they worked as volunteers, because they were also working in the space of the government and the state, and the relations with other citizens, because the book is about caring citizens. Do they see this caregiving as their responsibility? And what's their attitude towards the fact that other citizens either do or do not do this responsibility? So this is my question. And as for the citizenship, we can talk in the context of women from the East, how they see it in the context of 2014 and after the beginning of full-scale war. If there is no third question, then I will take Hannah's question and I will ask you more about the chronology of the volunteering activity. We talked a lot about war chronology, where it starts, where it transforms into some new phase. What were other referent points? Because for me, the role of Maidan was very important, the Revolution of Dignity, 2014, and also the experience of volunteering that were the building stones that made the pathway into the volunteering practice. What their chronology looked like and what were some of the experiences that they used to capitalize on. Comparison and comparative dimensions. I was also researching the French books and the books about Armenia, so about the involvement of citizens to the mobilization processes from the viewpoint of civilization of the war, because the involvement of civilians into the warfare outside the combat activities, and also informal practice of assisting the military, caregiving and different forms of voluntary activity. For example, getting equipment for the military, etc. In Armenia, it was well researched, and I believe that experience of Armenia reflects this 2014 period of war, because this is the situation where there was no war, no peace. The country lives in this ongoing conflict, very fluid conflict, and the prospects of peace is not on the horizon, and the war continues to structure political and social life of the country. And from this viewpoint, the experience of Armenia is very similar. No peace, no war is anthropological phenomenon. and it maintains a certain level of tension in society. And by their routine practice, they are trying to adapt to the situation, and they can be prepared to the new phase of war. And I believe that Armenian experience is very similar to Ukrainian experience between 2014 and 2022. As for the anthropology of the citizenship, I believe you refer to easing the acts of citizenship, or maybe some other works and some other authors. I decided not to look into the qualification whether this is the act of citizenship or not. I rather build from bottom up the continuum of civil practices. I call it the continuum because on one hand we see the citizenship of specific deeds, what I can do today or tomorrow to help the servicemen, what I can do if I work as a volunteer in Kharkiv hospital. So this is one point of this continuum. The other point is activism. Myself, having experience in the hospital, I can actually voice certain requirements to the government and shape the politics. And in this group, everybody chooses their practice, how they practice the citizenship, depending on the feeling of capability, whether they can enter some political sphere of activism or the failure to understand this capability, and maybe having the feeling that today you can do better if you can lobby certain decisions. When we get back to the act of citizenship, it's not typical practice for them, for majority of those women, and I believe that this female role is going to reshape. It's going to leave the circle of family, it enters the public sphere, the sphere of hospital. Some are getting even noticeable on the level of Kharkiv, so they became activists, they were recognized, and I feel use this word female emancipation in the framework of traditional gender hierarchy, which allows reform their role and reframe their role depending on the feeling of capability. And this affects the relationship with the government. Either I help the government on the basic law level, conditionally I close the gaps where the government fails to, or I develop activist practice. And Yarina, who is a very renowned person in Kharkiv, she's famous because she was the leader of the Sisters of Mercy organization. This is how she demonstrates her citizenship practice. As for the chronology of volunteering movement, so there was Maidan, and this is the continuity of historical processes, how they changed the trajectory of people. 3 women from this group were involved in Maidan. So Yarina was a very powerful leader of Maidan, or rather she became the leader. She was less known, less famous, and she was not involved in activism before that. And this Maidan community, social networks that were working, so they helped them find the way to this hospital. They were looking for opportunities to act, to find their roles during the war, and Maidan contributed to that. Maidan was a very remote event for other characters, and this is experience of their family members or friends who either were mobilized or who got injured, and that's why they were involved in volunteering movement. Speaking of volunteering and the practice that we had, In our stories, we also mention Orange Revolution as very important experience that changed the involvement and attitude to political involvement. And another story that I thought of today when I was listening to Ioulia's story, this is involvement in election as observers. For some people, for our characters, for example, that was the experience that changed their attitude to their involvement in political life and affected their further story. Speaking of activism and volunteering movement, the beginning of the war for those women was 2014. 2022 did not come as something unexpected. However, they did not think that it would be that bad. But their stories are definitely about 2014. They related less about 2022 compared to 2014. And these different types of voluntary activity as a result of this experience, I'm talking about this particular group of characters, because we were collecting information about actively involved people in the public life. So they were involved in different types of activity, actively involved, but they were not related directly to the war, but nevertheless they were always active. And I believe that on the level of regional ethos of a small town, there was a strong feeling, who if not us? This is our town. If you want kindergarten, go ahead, do it. If you want flower bed, go ahead and do it. And that was the position that they had to own it. So they were not political activists, but they were just trying to maintain and beautify their common space. We have another... we have time for another question or comment or feedback, if you are willing to. If no, I'd like to give the floor to our panelists so that they can do the summation based on our discussion. I'd like to go back to the trajectories of those women. I position this book as analysis that helps us understand those processes. And I believe that further trajectory proves that, because what we see is the continuity, the initiative exists, and those women keep working as volunteers in Kharkiv hospital. However, their role changed slightly. Some of them are abroad. They play the role of mother, and they are constantly seeking for involvement. Even being abroad, they are trying to seek the involvement in processes happening in Ukraine. And this is also about the reflection of the possibility to come back and find new roles, because we have the tendency towards institutionalization of this care, the support of the military, also the possibility to join the ranks of the armed forces. And when I was talking about citizenship as the fluid practice that constantly changes and reframes, one of our volunteers joined armed forces. She became the psychologist, and now she's providing psychological support, which only enhances the idea of citizenship as a very contextual practice related to the feeling of capability. And what I call the civil emancipation. As for my final observations, I'd like first of all to say thank you to Ioulia for this work, because it was very important for me to understand this viewpoint for external audience of our reality and social fabric, which is intensely reframed in the times that we are living at. What we collected, so there was Kramator's collection of memories for our archive. I'm only dreaming that they become food for thought for such research, or become the material that we can use to build on some broader research, because this methodology that we use and we work on gives the possibility to probe, and of course 20 or 27 stories, it's not enough sample for different generalization, but it gives food for thought and materials for thought. And those who are interested in looking at our collection, we are open for cooperation, we are ready to share, and if you feel it's useful and you can reflect on that, so feel free to approach us. I'm sure that your projects will definitely have life, either in translation or in new initiatives that can become the initiatives for Postbellum Ukraine. And now I'd like to mention John Rolter. We were talking about caregiving. She's one of the philosopher and theoretists about the caregiving in social sciences, and she's talking about care as relationship, and solidarity is one of the key principles that the care is built on, because care should not be the burden of one person, usually a woman. So the care should be divided in society, and it should be the burden of everybody if we want to make the common. So we have to take care of each other, we have to take care of our dearest and nearest, about our cities, landscapes, pets, memories, time, and I believe that we managed to work within the time limits that were allocated to us. Thank you very much for taking part in this discussion, and join us in other events. Have a great and peaceful evening.